right, well, folks, to be conscious of time, we'll go ahead and get started and keep letting everyone in from the waiting room as they arrive. I want to thank you all for joining us for our November Public Service Perspectives presentation today on this gorgeous fall day. Hope some of you are sitting outside and tuning in. Before I turn it over to our speaker, just want to go over a couple quick housekeeping items. For those who are attending virtually, we just ask you keep your microphone muted to avoid any disruptions, but encourage you to use the chat throughout the session to communicate with our speaker. She also welcomes you if you have a question in the midst of the presentation. Feel free to raise your hand and we can take a pause and answer, but we will reserve some time at the end for Q&A. And when we roll around time for Q&A, you can either continue to drop your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. Last thing to note is we are recording this session, so it'll be available to watch on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Before we get started, if anyone has any announcements or any upcoming events they want to share, I welcome you to go ahead and unmute yourself and let the group know what we've got coming up soon.
All right, thanks, Mackenzie. I apologize. Someone is asking me about how to join the session, so I'm trying to text them the information. So really excited to have Dr. Amanda Weinstein with us today. So she is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Akron. And Amanda has done some really interesting work around what small communities can do with quality of life in the Midwest. To look at creating economic opportunity and economic revitalization. And I thought this would be particularly relevant to folks here at the Voinovich School and many of our partners throughout Appalachian, Ohio, and the entire state as we work towards looking at how might we help our own community. So a lot of policy relevance here in her work. So really excited that Dr. Weinstein could join us. And what we will do is turn it over to her for her presentation. She did say she would take questions along the way, but that may be a little bit challenging. But if you have something, you can put it in the chat and we'll try to flag her. Otherwise, we will take the questions at the end. I do ask that you please mute yourself so we don't hear any background noise. And with that, we'll let you take it away. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. So I am excited to talk about this. So this is some work that I have done with some co-authors, Mike Hicks and Emily Warnell at Ball State University. Also get a little bit into some work I did with Locke Reynolds, who's at Kent State. But this is kind of a general theme of my research that I've been looking at since grad school at Ohio State, where I've been kind of thinking about this idea of resilience and can we rebound, especially in the face of some pretty significant, declines. So a little while ago, if you happen to see, Ohio started advertising the benefits of coming to Ohio in various places. So this is one of their billboards that was up in New York City that was really trying to, brag to the people of New York City that, hey, we are the fifth lowest actually in corporate income tax revenue. So here they're saying like, hey, come to Ohio, right? Why be in New York City when you can be here with our very low taxes, right? And they're right. We do have low corporate income tax. We, are fifth lowest in that revenue. So what do we get for that? So if you look at job growth since the pandemic happened, we rank 45th in our recovery. When the rest of the nation now has more employment than before the pandemic, we have less. So if you saw the most recent jobs report in the nation for Ohio, we lost the most jobs in the nation in September. So we don't seem to be getting these big benefits that, they're claiming we should from having these really low corporate income tax rates. So if you take a look at what that looks like, this is showing you every state, and then this blue dash line is the US and how we're doing in terms of, you can see that downturn during the pandemic and how we're doing in our recovery. And you see for a while, we kind of tracked the nation, but we have not tracked the nation in some time. And we are now doing, worse than the nation. We have not recovered from the pandemic when most states have recovered from the pandemic. So this was another billboard that was actually up in Austin, Texas, basically saying, hey, kind of, why are you living in Austin? They have a high cost of living, right? Come live in Ohio where we have a low cost of living. So this sign, I think, is also kind of interesting when you think about, the era we are in right now of really high inflation and high costs. So this billboard went up even before we had that high inflation to say, hey, you've got really high cost of living there. Why not come where there's a lower cost of living? So if you compare the city in Ohio that's been doing the best, that's Columbus. So that red line there is Columbus. And if you compare it to Austin, you can see Austin's growth has outpaced Columbus, even though it has this higher cost of living. All right. So it's not low corporate income taxes. It doesn't seem to be our cost of living here. Right. So when we think about all of this kind of economic development marketing, is what I'm initially calling it. It's really more, I think of it as this like bat signal, right? So if you watch, the superhero movies, they put the bat signal up and they're really trying to say, hey, we need help, Batman, come help us, right? So that billboard you see saying, hey, we have, very low corporate income tax rates is saying, hey, companies, right, come help us. And a lot of what we do with economic development policies, I should say traditional economic development policies, are really about using, tax incentives and non-tax incentives to try and attract companies to come locate in Ohio or locate in our city and save our town. And these economic development incentives are increasingly used by policymakers to try and save our town, to try and save our economy, to try and spur growth. So we're kind of sold this idea that if we just can get these companies here using these tax and non-tax incentives, right, they will be like this Superman coming to save our state, save our town. So in reality, though, right, that's not quite what the research shows on these economic development incentives. Right. So I think about here, if we pull this curtain back, so, thinking in the Wizard of Oz kind of movie, right? If we pull the curtain back and see what's actually going on with these economic development incentives, how much do they actually help our economy? Right. So then we see they're less like this Superman. A lot of my references, by the way, come from the movies I watch, which right now is mainly children's movies. So I'm just going to throw that out there. So rather than Superman, I think of him more, if you've watched The Incredibles, it's a little more like Syndrome, right? Where he really wants to be the superhero and he wants to have all the attention and really wants to be a superhero, but he ends up kind of wrecking the town, right? So if you look at the research on these economic development incentives, they're pretty controversial, especially among economists who find things like they end up crowding out economic activity. The goal is to attract firms. And even though they might actually attract that one firm, it ends up crowding out more firms that would have come otherwise. And so the net result is that we have actually lower business startup rates in the research. And there's also other negative effects that can come from, trying to attract firms in this way. And Tim Bartik, who's done a lot of research in this area, suggests that there's also negative effects then from how you pay for this, right? How do you pay for these non-tax and tax incentives, right? And if it comes from lowering public services, that could have an impact on your economy. So what do we do then, right? So now what? So I also kind of think about this as if you're at the pool with your kids, right? And your kids, the most common thing the lifeguards tell children, right, is, right, don't run, right? No running. So I kind of think about this as a little bit like, don't run. These economic development incentives, right? They're not doing what we think that, what we're sold that they can do. They're not the superhero that that we're told that they're going to be, right? So instead of don't run, right? Lifeguards typically say walk, right? So what do we do, right? So again, going back to the Wizard of Oz reference here, right? So in the end, what she learns is regardless of the grayness. So I love that quote because Ohio actually is beautiful today. Typically, right, this time of year, though, it's a little more gray outside. But regardless of the grayness, there's no place like home, right? That's the big thing she learns in The Wizard of Oz. So when you look at this idea of quality of life, of having a nice place to live, a nice place to make this healthy home, when I started studying this and along with my co-authors, right, we started to think about this as this kind of revolution, as this new thing in our economies, that was really having this impact on our economies, that really quality of life was increasingly important. And we thought of it as a new thing. But the more that we kind of dug into this in the history, we found it was less a revolution and more this very long evolution that we just haven't quite caught on in some areas. So if you look at California, So this is a picture of Santa Barbara, I think. Gorgeous, typically ranks among the top in, any quality of life study. Yeah, we get it. Beaches, palm trees, it's gorgeous. We get it. But this isn't something new that happened in California. It actually started happening when we first connected our first intercontinental railroad, which connected basically the entire US and gave people an easy way to actually get to California. A bunch of people started going to California. And California, very early on, this is the 1900s, started marketing itself. And it did not market its low tax rates. And it did not market its low cost of living. If you know anything about California, it does not have. It also does not have a low cost of living, right? That's not what they marketed. What they marketed in the 1900s is that they had a comfortable, healthy place to make a home, right? It was all about California is a nice place to live. And this is how they really branded themselves. And this is what entrepreneurs came out to California to do, building, hotels that were these great places to enjoy the beach and the fresh air and all these things. California, since its beginning, basically marketed itself as, hey, we're just a nice place to live. And so I came across this quote from an economist, Nicholas Barman. This is 1690, right? So basically, it's kind of very old English language. But when he's thinking about kind of how does our economy grow? How does our economy move on and, grow and do better? And how do we get this economic growth, right? A lot of times we think about, especially these incentives, like what do we need? But when you look at it, what we actually need to survive is pretty little compared to what we have, right? We need food, shelter. We actually don't need that much. So what he suggested in 69 is actually more about what we want, right? What we want. And so we're kind of thinking about when we think about what we want. So here you might be thinking about fashion and the Industrial Revolution, right? This is what is causing economic growth. A lot of it is what we want. So when we look to the research, what we see is for big cities, so this is from Ed Glazer and others, that the quality of life of a place is increasingly important to its economic success, that it matters if this city, and typically in Glazer's work here focuses on large metropolitan areas, it matters more for them to be what he calls these centers of consumption, right? A place to go buy what we want, whether what we want is a bookshop or a coffee place. So this is actually the town I live in, Hudson. So this is our downtown, and you can see some of the cute little things that we can buy there. Learned Owls, our cute little bookshop. But basically what, Ed Glazer and others says, it matters increasingly so for cities. We need to be places where we have high quality of life, where you can go get the things that you want. So this is an article that was in The Economist. This quote was from The Economist not too long ago that says mayors are increasingly shifting their focus from attracting firms to attracting residents by improving quality of life. Mayors in a lot of cities are starting to get this, and they're starting to think, how do we improve quality of life? What do people want that will make my city nice? So here I have kind of some pictures. So these are mainly from Indiana of some of the things that they've done to improve the quality of life in various cities in Indiana. All right, so how do we know what people want, right? Well, we could ask. So I think this is something economists don't naturally do, and we're maybe not the best at talking to people sometimes, but we could ask people, well, what do you want? What do you think is nice? So I loved this idea. This is from Michigan. They thought of this creative way to ask people what they wanted in this town. And so it was this quality of life game they would have people play. And as they played, they would give feedback of what they liked or didn't like about this area of their town, which I think is great. I think asking people definitely, but the people who actually played the game and turned it into the town are maybe not a representative sample of everyone in the town. So here I think about for mayors and city council, if you think about the people that show up to those city council meetings, for anyone that has been to a city council meeting, also not a representative sample. So to be clear, I am by no means saying that you should not listen to the people who show up. Everyone deserves to be listened to by their elected officials. But our elected officials also need to know that this person they're hearing from, right, may not represent the majority of people in their district, right? So what does? How do we know? So this is where I love the work I do in economics. I love taking data and try and reveal the preferences of everyone, whether you showed up to that meeting or not. If you're a mom with kids, you don't have time to go to the council meeting, these little data points will show up in my data so that I can see what you want. So what we have found with this data is that we know that households are willing to pay higher housing prices and even accept lower wages in areas with a high quality of life. So what that means is we can use markets to see not just what people say, but if people kind of put their money where their mouth is, right? And look at the premium people are willing to pay to live in this really nice place. So what we do is we use these markets, we use housing markets and labor markets to estimate quality of life as revealed through households' decision in every county across the US. So this is where it's actually different. So what I told you about Ed Glazer talking about the importance of quality of life, he was talking about for large cities. So the typical quality of life estimation is for large cities, because what I just explained about, using these markets is typically what they use is micro level data, which requires a large sample of data. We don't have a large sample of data. We don't have that for small towns. We don't have that for rural towns. So what we did is we created a new methodology that essentially lets us use average housing prices and characteristics and average wages and demographic characteristics to then estimate this premium people are willing to pay to live in each county, not just for big cities. So this is what that looks like across the US. So what we do is we take the premium people are willing to pay in terms of how much, if you think about the real estate agent, right? They're all about location, 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 right? What is that location premium of that house? So here, if you're looking down, if you're into the equations, that's that theta R. We're estimating what's that premium you're willing to pay out of housing prices to live in this county. And also, if there's any amount you're willing to accept in lower wages to live in this county. So my co-author actually recently talked to someone in Michigan, and we found out that in Traverse City, if you've ever been to Traverse City, beautiful location, right? Lakes, nice amenities. But there's a saying there that it's basically half the pay for a view of the bay, that they kind of are recognizing that wages are lower in order to live in this really nice place. And we hear the same thing from employers, right? So attracting an accountant to, I'm going to pick on North Dakota. North Dakota, it's harder than attracting an accountant to live in, Santa Barbara, right? So wages kind of factor in there as well. So when we look across the US, so here darker blue is higher estimated quality of life. So some of the dark blue that pops up, you can see on the West Coast there, probably we like beaches or what's going on there. That makes sense. You see that mountain area is blue, probably we like mountains. This also makes sense. So if you also look around the Appalachian area, that kind of orange, what we see kind of bubble up there is the Appalachian area seems to be struggling in terms of quality of life. It's not offering people there a high quality of life in a way that attracts people to that location. So another thing we can do with this data is not just estimate the quality of life, but the quality of the business environment in a similar way to households, right? So households, if they really like an area, they're willing to pay a premium to locate there. Now, if businesses really like an area, same thing. If you really like an area and you want to be around or located in that area, because, for example, you have access to very talented people. So this, for example, would be, Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is a very expensive place for a business to locate. They still locate there. Why? Because they have access to the people that are there and that are highly educated computer programmers in Silicon Valley, right? So one thing we do see pop up with our estimate of the quality of the business environment, right? We do see that West Coast still does pretty well in the business environment, and that Appalachian area actually does a little bit better on the business environment than it does on quality of life. All right, so then what we wanted to do is we take our estimations of quality of life and the quality of business environment and see how does this affect our economies. So we are estimating quality of life for 2010, which I know at this point is dated, we're in 2022, but we did this because what we want to look at is how does quality of life impact population growth and job growth in these counties. So what I have here is I have a scatter plot where I pulled out small towns. because this was really what we wanted to focus on this work, is we wanted to look at small towns, which were typically ignored by a lot of the quality of life literature. And here I've further pulled out the small towns in the Midwest, right? So maybe quality of life matters for California. You've made your, comfortable, healthy home, but does it matter for the Midwest? And what we found is absolutely it does. And actually it matters even more for small towns in the Midwest. So here, if you look at these two scatter plots, what we show is that quality of life is associated with higher population growth and higher job growth for these small towns in the Midwest. So I talked a little bit about Traverse City, right? Have to pay for a view of the bay. It pops up as one of those places with a high quality of life, also doing really well on population growth. So if you look at the quality of the business environment, in terms of population growth in the Midwest, we actually see a negative relationship there. That if you go after that quality of the business environment, you actually see lower population growth and no effect on jobs. What matters was quality of life, not quality of the business environment. So this is a recent working paper we wanted to look at is, so we started this work before COVID, and then COVID happened, right? So one thing we were interested in is like, what's going on with COVID? So one thing that happened in the wake of COVID is we see this sudden increase in remote work. So what the sudden increase in remote work means is that even more so now is that our jobs, our labor markets are less tied to our location, right? So now we have an increasing ability, a lot of workers have an increasing ability compared to before the pandemic to live anywhere and still work, right? So now we're thinking about, all right, how does this now affect our findings? And as you might guess, it really strengthened the relationship between quality of life and population growth. So what this scatter plot is showing, so this is now for all counties in the US, it's looking at the relationship between our estimated quality of life and population growth before and after the pandemic. So that red line shows you that positive relationship where higher quality of life places had higher population growth before the pandemic. The black line, that kind of where you see it shifted up, is after COVID, right? So this is not a long set of data after COVID, right? So, what we're calling in the wake of COVID here, right? But what we see is that COVID at least strengthened that relationship where we see population increasingly went to high quality of life places. Now, will it come back to the red, right? As some of the remote work maybe goes away, right? Possibly. But if we think about remote work, I don't think remote work is going to go back to pre-COVID times. Some of it's going to stick around, which means likely the importance of quality of life only, bumped up and increased in the wake of COVID. So when we look, so this is now thinking about these smaller towns and in the Midwest communities, what does this mean for them? So if we go back and think about how we're measuring this quality of life. So this high quality of life places are this top left quadrant in blue here. These are our highest quality of life small towns in the Midwest. And so you see some pop up like Salina, Ohio. So if anyone's been through Salina, Ohio, I actually drove through it for the first time about a year ago, and I was super excited. So I was actually on my way to visit my co-authors in Ball State in Muncie, and I drove through Salina. I was like, hey, I know about Salina, super cool. And so it was kind of fun to drive through there and be like, I don't know why my data says this is a town that is posed. It's got higher estimated quality of life. And it's potentially a town that, if we, capitalize on this high quality of life, it could do well as a small town. So if you look at Salina, it's got a lake, it's got a cute downtown, it's got, a gorgeous lake, cute small town. And I was kind of like, yeah, I can see this, right? This, this kind of makes sense. So you see kind of Whitewater, Wisconsin in there. Also cute little towns, got a university in it. You start to see in the Midwest, these are some of the towns that really are posed to do well if they capitalize on the quality of life. So if you look at the green box in the top right, so those are areas that I would say have, so if we think about the blue box, the blue box is kind of high quality of life, great place to live. So the green box I kind of think about is great place to live, but also a great place to work. And you see other areas that have kind of a little bit more industry in there, but also have a lot of really nice amenities in these areas. So the bottom right yellow box, so these are places with a low housing premium, right? There's no premium to live there. Generally think that was maybe a good place to work, but not as nice of a place to live. And the bottom left box, I would say, if there's any box you don't want to be in, this is probably the box. So this is the box we kind of think about as not particularly a nice place to live, and also maybe not particularly a nice place to work. These towns are the towns that we think, unless they do something big to change something, they're probably going to struggle. And so when we're thinking about kind of these different boxes and where towns could end up, you know, one thing going back to that economic development incentives research said that some of the negative effects that come from this focus on business and attracting businesses comes from lowering public services. So if you are trying to improve your business environment in a way that reduces your quality of life, that can have negative implications for job growth and population growth. All right, so when we think about what, I've talked a lot about kind of what makes a place nice, and showed you a little bit about kind of, you know, with Celine and other places, you know, some things that might make it look nice. So what exactly makes a place nice, right? So I think that is kind of a big question. All right, if quality of life is important, what makes something have a higher quality of life? What makes this a nice place to live? So the first thing we think about, especially, you know, we saw that West Coast there, we saw those beaches. I get it. Beaches are nice, right? So nice weather, beaches, mountains, all of those things probably improve quality of life. So what we looked at is we took a USDA natural amenity scale, that's on that x-axis down there, compared it to quality of life. And yes, we see places with better natural amenities generally have a higher estimated quality of life. There's a but here, but not in Ohio. So in Ohio, so the red dots circles here are counties in Ohio. The gray circles are all the other counties. And what we see is, yes, generally for counties across the US, small and big, we see if you have better natural amenities, you have higher population growth, but not in Ohio, right? So then the question here is why? What is going on? Is it because Ohio doesn't have any natural amenities, right? We don't have a beach. We don't have the Rocky Mountains, right? So that's why it doesn't matter. We have natural amenities. And there are people that think this. So I have not attributed this quote. If you really want to know, I will tell you, but I don't, want to really call anyone out. But someone living in Northeast Ohio said, Northeast Ohio doesn't have the luxury of a geographical crown jewel, no ocean, no mountain range, no grand desert, or any majestic vista really to speak of. I'm in Northeast Ohio. We have one of the only Great Lakes in the entire world. So to hear someone in Northeast Ohio say that we have no natural amenities whatsoever was a little disheartening for me. So this is also a photographer. I will tell you that about this quote. It's a photographer in Northeast Ohio that said this, but also not that surprising. So the bottom right, this is a picture of one of the few Great Lakes in the entire world. And this is how we have capitalized on that natural amenity. So what is this big land area that you see up there? For those of you that are familiar with Cleveland might know, that's Burke Airport, right? So that is a not regularly used airport that we put on our Great Lake, right? So imagine, so here I think about San Diego, right? Imagine San Diego was like, man, we're going to take over a ton of beach space. Just put another little airport in there. So we have a second airport. I don't think people in San Diego would tolerate it. In Ohio, I would suggest we have natural amenities. We have a lot of natural amenities that I know I love, but in a lot of cases, rather than capitalizing on them, we have done the opposite. And we've actually made our natural amenities worth less by either this could be through pollution or extracting them rather than capitalizing on them.
Amanda, real quick, on that slide, someone posted in the chat. What's the large circle at about 18% growth and minus 2.5 on the amenity scale? I think it's the biggest red circle, I believe, is what they're referring to.
Oh, let me see. Well,
Top
that
of your
actually,
head.
that, are you talking the big circle with the gross but lower amenities?
Yes, yes, the red circle.
Oh, that is a good question. So I don't know. So if it's a large, so the size of the circle is based on the population. So
Okay,
my guess would be it would have to be like, oh, that might be Franklin County.
okay,
Oh, so I don't know for sure. I would have to look at it. And that's a great question. I'm pretty sure that's Franklin County. So something I say, and sometimes when I talk to people about this, especially in Ohio, is I don't know a nice way to say this. There's nothing particularly nice about Columbus. There just really isn't. It's a flat nothing. It's got no Great Lake. The river there's not great. Oh, Columbus is truly a flat nothing. There's nothing particularly, fantastic about it. Everything that makes Columbus nice has been built up, right? So if we think about even like the Columbus Zoo and the shopping areas and, shopping by Ohio State, you've got Ohio State University, you've also got the Capitol there. So those two things help. Everything that has given Columbus the growth it has not come from its natural amenities. It's just not that nice when it comes to natural amenities. So let's get to the built stuff. All right. So then when we're looking at, all right, what improves quality of life? So we started off with, and I should have a count, it's about 300 or so different measures of amenities by county, which is a lot. So typically in the quality of literature research, they'll do, a few categories, 7 categories of amenities, or they'll look at specific amenities and see what the effect is. We wanted to throw everything we could possibly measure at this model and see actually what kind of bubbled up to the surface. So we did this with a kind of fun econometric methodology to see which has the most statistical power at predicting quality of life. So this is what this is doing, is it's picking out some of these natural amenities. So something that comes out, nice weather. We like nice weather. Yep, sure. Having, moderate climates, that helps. So, and we kind of broke them up into natural amenities. So there we're measuring hilliness, mountains, beaches, weather, all of the natural amenities that policymakers really can't change, but you can capitalize on them. And then we have kind of a broad category of private goods and services. So private goods and services, here I think about kind of going back to that needs and wants idea, captures some of both, right? So one thing that pops up are things like food stores. And here I think nobody wants to live in a food desert, right? And that shows up in our data, right? So people want access to the things that we need, right? We need food stores. That pops up, having access to food stores, high quality of life. But also what pops up is recreation, right? So here recreation I think about is, you could kind of think about this as natural amenities. So here I put it in private goods and services, but have we capitalized on the natural amenities that we do have on our lakes, trails, all of these things? This is also an excuse to show you cute pictures of my children, right? We love hiking. So this is a waterfall. It's actually I think it's 15 minutes from my door to get to that waterfall. I can get to in 15 minutes, right? That's amazing. I've lived in Colorado. There was no waterfall I could get to in 15 minutes anywhere I lived in Colorado, right? This is an amazing thing. So my brother came and visited us and was like, wow, like I didn't know you even had a waterfall in Ohio. I was like, we do. We have like more than one waterfall. And he's like, man, and you can get to it in 15 minutes. I was like, I can. But so here, what pops up is recreation, building on the natural amenities that we do have. People increasingly like recreation, getting out there, things to do. Arts and culture is a big one. So here, what we can show with our data, right, is that we generally have things classified as this is kind of a recreation place, or this falls into the category of kind of arts and culture. And so this is really also where, policymaker and people really need to think about their town. So I can tell you, on average, recreation matters, arts and culture matters. But what I can't tell you specifically, or at least in this data right now, is, well, what about arts and culture, right? So what we generally think is going on is that on average, arts and culture matters. Now, does that mean we take the arts and culture that worked for Austin and try to make Athens the new Austin? I would suggest no. I think what Austin did is, create their own culture around what they think makes it unique and weird. And, if you've heard, keep Austin weird. I think Athens and every city needs to think about what makes us unique, right? What can we build on? What can you get here? whether it's, stores, restaurants, recreation activities that you can do. So I pulled this picture as one of, Athens, cute little things that they do. They have the bounty on the bricks. And I was like, oh, yes, right. This is a cute little event, that builds on, the arts and culture of Athens and their cute little downtown. I was like, yes, what a great picture. But yeah, so this is really thinking about how do we, cover people's needs. We need food. Also our wants, right? To think about how do we then create our wants and make something kind of unique with what we have. So this is also where I think especially small businesses and quality of life come together. So sometimes when I show people that really focusing on the business quality isn't important for population or employment means that businesses don't have a place in quality of life, which is hands down not true. Businesses do. I think it tends to be small businesses and the businesses that are focusing on locally what local residents need and want, right? So there I'm thinking about your local entrepreneurs who maybe opened a brewery or opened an indoor play place. So this is not our indoor play place. This is one that I thought looked amazing. But, we go to an indoor play place all the time, which basically means even when we have winters, which we have winters in Ohio, where I can't take my kids to a playground or I won't because they'll complain too much, right? We have an indoor play place. Great, right? These are businesses that have done that, right? So when we think about businesses and their role here, right? Businesses have a crucial role in providing the local goods and services that we need and that we want. So this is also new research, no paper yet, but I was thinking more about these businesses. And one thing when we look at high quality of life places, they might attract entrepreneurs, right? They also have demand ready for them, local goods and services, if we're used to buying local goods and services. But another interesting thing that I came across is that if we look at high quality of life places, they tend to provide an abundance of what's called these third places, right? So you have, I think first place is your home, second place is your work, third place is this place where you can come together and meet people to socialize, talk about things, happy hours, all of those things. And if you look back to the Enlightenment, a lot of people and historians attribute the Enlightenment to having these third places. So this would be like the London Coffee House. So this picture here is of the London Coffee House, which was, the meetup where you would meet, talk about these new ideas. And they attributed, even the Enlightenment to having these third places like the London Coffee House. So what I wanted to look at is not only do I think businesses improve quality of life by providing local goods and services that people want and need, but I also think just having better quality of life spurs business development. So here, what I looked at, this is for all counties, is I looked at the relationship between quality of life and growth in the number of business establishments. And what I find is that, yes, higher quality of life actually does a better job at spurring business startups than quality of the business environment. So the last kind of big category we looked at of amenities were public goods and services. And so what we find shows up here are things like having low crime rates, better health outcomes. Here, I think broadly is kind of connectivity. So here we looked at the share of people that remote work. So we think if you have a better ability to work from home in these places, so that could be broadband, that connectivity helps. So connectivity to a metro area helps for when you want those big city amenities, and school spending. The most consistent predictor, strongest statistical strength we found of all of these 300 some amenities that we kind of threw at this model was school spending. Schools matter. So I think schools are a need. I need my kids in school. So they're not like running around here as they did in the pandemic, right? When they yelled that they went to they need to go to the bathroom in the middle of a presentation. I need my kids in school. I also want good schools. So it's kind of a need and a want, I think about this. Schools are very important, right? So one thing that Tim Barczyk says about these economic development incentives that could be particularly problematic is if you are funding these economic development incentives, trying to attract businesses and paying for it by lowering school spending, that is going to have a significant long-term effect on your community. So when I presented this research to, so it's actually a businessman and politician, and said, here's broadly what my research shows. So he said, yeah, as a business, this makes sense. And I was like, oh, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, as a business, right, your current client should come first. You are not going to be able to attract new clients if your current clients aren't happy. People are going to talk about that. And I was like, ooh, I like that. Right. So here, when we're thinking about our economy and economic development, for policymakers, your current clients come first. Are you meeting the needs and wants of your current clients, whether that's food stores, schools, recreation, arts, all of these things? And if you're meeting the needs of your current clients, right, you're going to have a better ability to attract new clients, whether that's new businesses or new people to come into Ohio and to come into your town. And a little caveat I will put in here, your clients might be women. So this comes from a paper I did with Locke Reynolds at Kent State. So there we actually showed that women have stronger preferences for the Midwest. We don't exactly know why. We just kind of looked at some regional differences and we're like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But women show stronger preferences for the Midwest. And when we started to look at some of the amenities women especially preferred, we found things like women were especially concerned about crime rates. Women, previous research shows, really don't like commutes, right? So this is one where Ohio does a pretty good job. Nobody likes a long commute. Women especially hate it. I think Ohio is pretty good on that front. Women care more about environmental quality. And so there's research out there that women kind of do a better job at connecting the environmental quality to the health, their own health and healthcare and their family's health. Also, women cared more about parks. So to be clear, it's not that men didn't like these things. Men preferred all these things in their cities too. Women just exhibited even stronger preferences for all of these things. And the other one that we looked at here, so if you look at this map, the black dots are cities women preferred more. The gray dots are cities that men preferred more. And there's a big gray dot in the south. It's in Alabama, in Gadsden. And we're like, man, women, and this one was not close. Women really don't like Gadsden, Alabama. If you're from Gadsden, look, women don't like it there. Men think it's fine. It's perfectly average. Women really don't like Gadsden, Alabama. And we're sitting there like, man, why do women not like Gadsden so much? I mean, and so we were I was sitting in my co-author's office and we're kind of Googling stuff. It's like, I don't know, there's a Goodyear plant down there. It's just like a blue collar town. I was like, whoa, I know that Goodyear plant. He was like, how do you know that Goodyear plant? I said, that's Lily Ledbetter's Goodyear plant. I was like, I think there's something else there. So we added in thinking about, well, let's look at some gender role attitudes. This one was also interesting. Both men and women preferred more egalitarian gender role attitudes, but it especially matters for women. So when we're thinking about from a policy perspective, right, what do we do to improve the quality of life in our town? One thing we need to make sure is that we're getting the input from everyone. And this can be hard if you have, for example, a male mayor and an all-male city council, right? Not that there's anything, wrong with that, but men aren't knowing what women want that well, right? So you're going to have to make sure, take extra effort to make sure that you're really getting the input of women, that your town is actually providing the amenities that women especially prefer. And the nice policy aspect of this is if you invest more in amenities that women prefer more, it's not that men don't like them. It's just that women prefer them even more than men prefer them. So when I think back to kind of where we started, right, economic development incentives gives us this idea that there's going to be this company that comes in and it's going to save our city. It's going to save our state, right? They're our Superman, our superhero, right? I don't think it is any coincidence that Superman, the comic book, was literally created in Cleveland, right? The history of Ohio and a lot of towns is that we did have a town where our economy rested on the back. So here I think about, Akron and having Goodyear and the rubber capital. It did rest on a company, but that's not where our economy is now, right? We cannot expect any one company or any one industry to swoop in like Superman and save it. We have to be the superheroes that we're waiting for, right? So that's all of us as community members, as business owners, to think about if there's something about our community we don't like, how do we change that, right? So if we don't like, a cold winter, right, where I can't go take my kids on a playground and they're, bouncing off the walls, man, is it really nice that I have a business owner that created an indoor play space for my family, right? If there's something we don't have in our community, can we create it, right? And here we're thinking about, what does our community need and want? We have to be the superheroes and foster everyone in the community to have this kind of entrepreneurial culture where we are the ones that step up to create the local goods and services that our community needs and wants. All right, so that is it, and I will open it up for questions.
Great, thanks. This
We'll
is
bring my
very
chat up.
fascinating, really appreciate it. So we did get a couple questions in the chat, and then folks can also, I think you can raise your hand on Zoom if you want to ask it in person, but kind of going back through the chat, make sure I don't miss any. One of the questions was, is there a way for you to run calculations on sort of the location premium for individual towns? So, you know, if someone wants, and you and I had a conversation about this before everyone got on, where I was talking to you about Athens, and I said I shared your research with the mayor, and he was looking into the details.
I know Athens has that Appalachian stuff going on, where it's got a little, not as bad as like the middle of Appalachian area, but it's a little, it's at the edge. Yeah.
So can you talk, maybe is that a possibility where a community might say, what's the location premium for our town? What are we doing well? And, you know, perhaps they may decide to inform some of their investments in quality of life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now we have this data for every county. So it's at county-wide. So I do think that there's some potential to dig down, probably to a closer look would have to be just based on how census does data, but we've been kind of toying around with census tracts. Is there a way that we can even look at neighborhoods, right? Are there neighborhoods that are particularly nice, less nice? What about those neighborhoods? So there's some issues with data on amenities. So I think census tracts is a way that I would like to eventually go so we can get it more disaggregated. So basically right now we can say on average, this county is, you know, nicer, not as nice, right? But it doesn't tell us, like, you might have, and we all know, you know, when you locate in a county, right, you're going to go live in a neighborhood, right? And so there might be fantastic neighborhoods in counties that aren't as nice. And, you know, that might be an issue though, for those places that are really nice, you know, that the county will probably affect them in terms of attracting people overall. But you could potentially get some really nice places, nice cities, nice neighborhoods that are capable of attracting kind of more than the data that's showing up in the data right now.
Great. So I see Jeff DeBelco, who's a professor here, has his hand up. Jeff.
Terrific. Thank you. It's just a fantastic presentation, Professor.
Well,
thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought. A couple, if I may, a couple questions. One on one of your last slides with the importance of the perspective of women's preferences. Do you see, it's obviously very early, but are you finding ways that you can build into your research the before and after the Dobbs decision in terms of, and would perspectives on that issue show up in that kind of, I forget exactly how you defined it, but kind of a positive environment from that kind of gender-based perspective? So that would be one question. And then kind of to make sure I'm doing the right takeaway. I mean, it strikes me, and I'm sure many of us who are focused and based here in kind of beautiful southeastern Ohio with the kind of lots and lots of tourism, but folks don't know it, that's driven by the natural environment. And see next door, West Virginia University, cherry picking some of our folks to go down there and start the Outdoor Economic Development Cooperative and really try to proactively message about come work remotely where you want to play, low cost of living and such. But it strikes me that that distinction that you draw between everybody pushing the enabling business environment is not really important and missing this other quality of life. Is that something that you are seeing any change or perceived understanding on the part of decision makers who might then change what that billboard looks like in New York City, as opposed to just, you know, we won't charge you any taxes, to that kind of live where you want to play? And then a final one, just to put on the future again, is if you are seeing any sign of Ohio having attraction in a warmer world, and I say that with the siting of these EV battery factories, we're going to still have water in ways that many places are not. And so lots of stories about water shortages inhibiting production from some of these high-tech industries and making the Rust Belt actually a water belt that be a very conducive environment to some of that production. Again, probably a looking forward, but maybe just an issue to put on your radar, something to take a look at in terms of decisions, in terms of citing new companies, and whether our decision makers even recognize that as a potential advantage.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. All right, so first on the Dobbs thing. So the Midwest has pros and cons for women. And some of the biggest pros are that a lot of women are from here, and their mom's still here and their dad's still here. And so actually my mom lives 10 minutes from me, right? Man, is it really nice to have some really cheap childcare right nearby, right? That is key for Ohio. So part of what I, talk about quality of life, I think policymakers underestimate how great it is to raise a family here, right? And it's not something we brag about, right? I don't know that I would even know that in a billboard they could put like, this is where you want to raise a family. I think there are mayors in town. So the mayor of our town, I think he knows this, and they know it very well. When you start to get more local, they know how important it is to, to have Ohio be a place that raises family. Now, on the flip side, if we think about the Dobbs decision, and when we hear policymakers in Ohio even throw out the idea of banning birth control, which one did, right? That's going to be an issue for women. So I actually had someone reach out to me yesterday, actually, saying that he has 4 adult daughters. 3 of them have left Ohio, and the 4th one is considering a move away from Ohio because of Ohio's policies, right? And so, kind of fitting into my research, what that means is when we do see that when women see places that are viewed as less egalitarian, they're not going to go there, and they're not going to prefer that place. And I think women have more of an impact on that than a lot of policymakers have been giving women credit for. So I talked about Ed Glazier there. So Ed Glazier is like the Harvard urban economist, loves cities. He is like city's biggest proponent. Does he live in a city? No, he does not. He lives in a suburb. Why does he live in a suburb? That's where his wife wanted to live, right? So I think we really underestimate the impact women have on decisions when it comes to this stuff. So in terms of policymakers, I would say presenting this research for me has been hardest in Ohio of convincing people that I have the data like that. So it depends on who. I should say it depends on who. So if you talk to urban planners, a lot of them, yep, they know this. Jane Jacobs, right? Cities are for people. But for policymakers, this is a hard sell for them. This is a totally different mindset. We have policymakers here that have relied on Goodyear and a number of different towns to what they think is, saving their economy. So for policymakers, this is a complete mindset change. When I talk to policymakers in Colorado, this research seems like a no-brainer to them, where they're like, why? So even to the point where I feel like some are like, why are you doing this research? This is obvious. And I'm like, it's not obvious to everyone. It really isn't. And this is important. But they get this. I mean, they love it because it reinforces what they're doing already. But in Ohio, this has been a hard sell, I would say. But for most policymakers, if I can sit them down and show them this data and the data backs this up, I think it at least makes them take a pause. And a lot of leaders, I've talked to some people in like leadership background type classes, who I think it really made them think differently about the way that they think about Akron. Now, it also means when we think about things like our climate resiliency, I think we do have some advantages for climate resiliency. But the flip side of this is we can't say we have all of this great water in a Great Lake, and we'll also let you dump in it and do whatever you want with it, right? So if we're going to tout something like our Great Lakes and our water, it also means we're going to have to take care of it, right? And so you kind of have to make sure that you're doing both and that we're doing things to actually take care of these resources that we also want to tout for people. Oh, so I'll also say for Southeast Ohio, I think even not knowing these big economic headwinds going on in quality of life is rough. So my family loves the wilds, which is, nearish down there. We love the wilds. One thing that drives me a little crazy when I drive to the wilds is you see basically a dead downtown of what used to be a town near that coal mine there. You don't see really, I have not seen any real effort for the nearby towns to capitalize on the fact that the wilds is there. You go to the wilds, the only place to eat is at the wilds, the only place to stay is at the wilds, and that's all it is. The only place to buy sunscreen, if you need sunscreen, because we forgot it, is at the wilds, right? And so I feel like we don't have this communication to a lot of community members that you have an asset here. Most of our natural amenities that we love so much are not in cities. They're in smaller towns and in rural areas. That's where, hiking trails are and lakes are, and, whether it's hunting areas, whatever it is. And we need to let people know that that's valuable and it has value to capitalize on.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So we are at time, but we can go a little bit over if you have another minute or two to spare with us. There were a couple of questions. Dr. Kim, I saw you had your hand up. Excuse me, then you took it down. I don't know if you still have a question or not.
Okay. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, good. I'm Young Kim in geography, and so I'm going to ask a geographical question here. So in one of those your earlier charts, there are some of the outliers in your charts. I mean, the counties with population growth, but not much economic growth, job growth there. So I was wondering whether those counties, the ones with annexation or new housing development, you see, so that might not have much to do with economic or amenity or any of those. It's rather just boundary changes or new housing development.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of the outliers, so I didn't talk much about outliers. So the outliers I think are really interesting. And so far what we've seen the outliers is they have a lot of information about actually quality of life. So what we find are some of the outliers that we see that have really tremendous growth, despite not being high quality of life, tend to be recently, because we're looking at here since 2010, they tend to be extractive industries and natural gas industries. So when we look across the US, some of these are small towns in Texas, small towns in North Dakota, where they have seen tremendous growth based on these extractive industries because of what we've seen with, things like hydraulic fracturing. So the other outliers that we see that I didn't talk about here. So when we look at the towns that are doing, just really, so some of them are in that bottom red square I said you don't really want to be in. So another thing I didn't talk about is what we see that pops up there is when you look across the US, the biggest outliers we see in the towns that are doing way worse, even way worse than they would expect based on their economy, based on their industry, they tend to be places that have really severe histories of racism. So one of them that pops up is in Arkansas. So I think it's called Hutchinson County in Arkansas, and it is known as where the KKK is. And so this was not something that we had in our data. We just didn't think about it. And it popped up in our outliers as something that we need to think about. So we actually do have that in the paper and we talk a little bit about that, but the outliers, basically what our outliers right now show are some of these extreme examples of, like, we see the headquarters of the KKK pop up that has some really severe issues with racism going on in those counties, or some extraordinary things going on. So with the rise of hydraulic fracturing, some counties just tremendously took off, pretty small counties. So one issue there, I would also caution when we focus on small counties, so we mainly focus on percent change in growth, which we prefer to look at. But what that also means for a small county, sometimes if a small county, for example, has 2 additional businesses, that's a huge percent change in growth, even though it might not be as big as it seems. So we do kind of caution a little bit of that with the small counties. But that's what we've seen in the outliers.
So I think we have time maybe for one more question, just a quick bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are in the room downstairs, please make sure that you sign in so we know who's there. So there were a couple questions that people asked on follows that I don't think we're going to be able to get to, but we can certainly circle back with you about some of this, Amanda. But one question that came up pretty early on, and I think Maddie asked it, she asked basically, how is can people access your data? And I'm assuming you collected that, so that might not necessarily be publicly available. But is some of that available? Is there any plans to develop a dashboard or any other kinds of things where folks might look at that? Because I think there's a lot of interest, certainly among many of the folks here doing very practical work about one, how does my community score, and then two, what might we do to kind of improve where we stand in some of these underlying factors?
Yeah, so I have some of the data available on so Tableau is one of my little hobbies that I've been teaching myself. So I've got a public Tableau out there where I've got some of the figures out there, and you can kind of click around and see the different towns and their things. So I can send you some of my public Tableau stuff. So we have talked about the data and getting a website out. So we have not done that yet. And kind of what is in the works is we would like to, so my co-authors at Ball State do more extension work than, we don't have an extension program at the University of Akron. And that how do we, use this to help communities who, need help at, what do we do, to improve the outcomes in our town?
And then lastly, Amanda, could you make a little bit of a pitch for, you're a rock star, so you're doing all kinds of interesting things. And I see, like, every time I turn around, you're doing something interesting. You also have a podcast, the Suburban Woman Problem podcast. So I know a lot of our folks here are very interested in some of the gender differences around quality of life. And we got some questions about, what do some of the recent Dobbs ruling and other things mean for women and some of their location decisions. So maybe we can sign off with you telling us a little bit about your podcast and how folks might be able to access that, because I think there'll probably be a lot of interest in that as well.
Yeah, so the podcast is a lot of fun. So I have two co-hosts, Jasmine Clark, who's in Georgia, and Rachel Vinman. And so we basically talk about, stuff that, concerns us, as suburban women. So schools, school funding, book bans are another thing that has come up for us that we have talked a lot about. And it actually kind of reminds me of, so I also, and on Twitter, I'm in kind of some of the urban planning discussions. So I consider myself a regional scientist, and I'd like to look at basically places, whether they're urban, suburban, and rural. And one thing that was interesting that I saw someone say on Twitter was like, you know what, the suburbs are only doing so well is because they cater to families. And I was like, yes, that is exactly right. They cater to families. This is why the suburbs are doing so well, right? So really, this is what we need all areas to do, right? If you think about catering to families, what does that mean? And it's kind of also a harder thing probably than I'm making it out to be, but it's, what do your families want? What do families in your community want, right? Good schools is probably pretty typical, but that might look different in every town, right? So in my town, we love our ice cream social, right? It's very like 1950s-esque. We love our ice cream social. It's something that we love. We come together and do a lot of events, right? This might be, so there's another, I think it's Salt Fork, has this very large hunting area right next to it. And I'm like, yes, right? Whatever your community likes, right? Do that thing. Other people might come out and do that thing because they can't do it in their community. So one interesting thing that I'd bring up here is when we think about economic development, another thing that the economic development incentives do is they pit communities against each other. So if you offer lower taxes, your neighboring county has to offer lower taxes. If you're offering Amazon, pick a number, 5 million, they're going to offer Amazon 7 million. It pits communities against each other with this quality of business approach. But quality of life actually finds the opposite. If you make your county nicer, it actually helps the county nearby, even if they don't do anything, right? And part of this, what we think is, well, if you create, a nice new park, the county nearby can still come visit the park, right? So that helps them. And so I think it was also an interesting approach to see that quality of life has a more collaborative community aspect to it, where I can make my town great and it doesn't make your town worse off because we made our town better. And it actually makes your town better even when our town becomes better, which I think is like a fabulous way to think about our economy as more collaborative and showing that, we can have a better impact. So I think, for kind of think about the podcast, we think about these things like what matters to families, right? So we think about that with policy, and I think about the quality of life. And I am also a part of family, so I'm no longer a single young woman. So our gender research is, focused a little bit more on single young women, but thinking about what can we do to make these places nice.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for spending time with us. I think you can tell there's a lot of interest in your work, and we're very excited about you sharing it with us. I think people will see you again. I'm already getting direct messages from people saying you should come and speak at this or that or other events. So we'll
Awesome.
probably try and keep your calendar full. Mackenzie, I'll give you the final word in case there's any housekeeping that I missed.
No, thanks, Jason. And thank you so much, Amanda, for coming. I want to echo his thanks, especially for staying on a couple minutes late since we had so many questions. It was such a great, engaging conversation. I think it gave folks a lot to think about in terms of our approach with economic development in Appalachian, Ohio. So thank you so much for taking the time to present with us today. I do want to remind everyone to save the date for our next session and final session of the semester. It will be on December the 2nd. We will be bringing Christine Dolly. She is an award-winning reclamation and conservation researcher. So we hope to see you all for that session, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.